On the 11th of March 2024, a Boeing 787-9, much like the one you're seeing on your screen now, suffered a nosedive whilst in the cruise at 41,000 feet. It was operating as LATAM Flight 800 between Sydney and Auckland. There were 12 people taken to hospital, and it's obviously quite a startling event and a very upsetting event for those involved on board the aircraft, but also has raised questions in a lot of people's minds about these airplanes and how this could happen in the cruise on a modern jetliner. The Boeing 787 is one of, if not the most advanced commercial airliner in the world at the moment, and it's not an event that you expect to see. I'm a commercial airline pilot and I fly the Boeing 787 in normal airline operations. So I wanted to talk about this incident today, which is something I don't normally do. But this is an aircraft that I operate, and I've seen a lot of discussion going on, obviously, around this incident, as you can understand. And I wanted to just share a bit of context about some of the things being discussed in this incident to do with the Boeing 787, and why I still think the Boeing 787 is, of course, an absolutely safe and fantastic airplane to fly on. So in this video, we're going to talk through some of the things that are being discussed. As ever, although I am a real-world airline pilot, nothing you see today is for any real-world use. This is not an incident that's been fully investigated yet. We do not know what actually happened, and we won't know until the full investigation is out. We only have a few reports to go by, so this is very much just a discussion about some of the topics being brought up to do with this incident, and I'll give you my perspective on those. Right, let's get started. Here we are in the cruise now in the 787. This is a pretty similar situation to what they'd have been in. We're at decimal 85 Mach number. We're actually 38,000 feet. They were at 41,000 feet, so a little bit higher. The airplane was a little bit lighter than the one we're in right now. But essentially a similar idea. 787s are very standardized. They all have pretty similar equipment fitted, unlike some older generations of aircraft where they'd have been adapted over time. The 787 being relatively new. So this is a pretty similar flight deck to what you can expect to have seen. Now, in the reports, there are quotes, and this is from the Av Herald source. They had quotes of a sudden dive and a feeling of weightlessness. This was something that passengers experienced all of a sudden whilst sat in the back of the airplane. Obviously, a very upsetting thing to go through. One report, this was from the BBC, somebody said that it appeared the person next to them was glued to the ceiling. So this is quite an extreme situation and not something that happens normally in aviation. Now, there has been talk about different fits to the Boeing 787, including something that has come up, and this is quoted on the Av Herald report at the moment, to do with a service bulletin to do with keeping the flight controls powered, or the flight control computers powered for too long, 22 days, and then they might all simultaneously reset. But that's an old bulletin, and it seems to be something that is fading in the past now. I believe there was a fix for that one, and obviously that was something that was caught in advance. What is getting discussed a lot now is the seat movement. And this is something that's really quite interesting. And I've seen discussion online, of course, of people suggesting that the seats may be unsafe, or that there's something wrong with the way the seats have been designed. And I want to talk today about how the seats are used and how they're moved, and how that could have caused this incident. Again, not saying it's caused this incident, but saying that you could foresee what may have happened, or see how the seats could be moved in such a way. So let's talk about it. So here is the 787 seat, and you've got several ways to control it. Like all commercial airliners or modern jetliners, or I should say most, it's electronically controlled. You can move it with the electronics to move up and down and forwards and backwards. As it runs backwards, there's rails on the ground. You can actually see them. They're pretty gloomy down there. But see these rails here? So the seat will move backwards and then sideways. This is so that the pilot can then maneuver into the seat via this sort of channel here. It creates a bit of space for them. So that is the normal way of doing it. There's an electronic rocker switch down here. It's not actually modelled on this model, but it is down here on each seat. There's a little white switch, and you can rock it backwards and forwards. On the front of that panel, there's another rocker switch that you can rock up and down, and that will move the seat vertically up and down. Now, this red switch says power on and off. This switch is what's used to control whether that seat mechanism is powered or not. So if this switch is in the off position, the seat will not move electronically. So if you think the seat's broken and isn't moving electronically, I recommend you check that power switch is on before you call the engineers. Ask me how I know, it's very embarrassing. There is another way to move the seat forward and backwards, only forward and backwards, and it's this little cover here. You can see fore aft switch lift guard. So that you lift up this little panel, spring loaded so it stays shut, and there's a rocker switch on there. And this is used a lot. It's used by the pilots as well, because when you walk into the flight deck, the seat would typically be in the forward position, so you can maneuver, put bags down, put your flight case down here if you need to. And then you can use this switch to then move the seat back, because it's quite fiddly to get your hand down the side here. So there's a third way of doing it. So those are the different ways of getting the seat to maneuver. There is the manual switches, which are shown here. You can see that you have a let's see if I can see, fore aft. It's just about visible down there. Fore aft lever here, so you push that down, and the seat will then freely, by using your legs or arms, you can maneuver the seat along the rails. And then there's another one on the other side for moving it up and down and tilting the back. So you can control the seat in several ways, manually and electronically. Now, that is quite a normal setup for a commercial airliner in this era. This is the same on the Airbus. It has electronic controls on a little switch down here on the Airbus, slightly more hidden away, not rocker switches. Well, they are sort of rocker switches, but slightly different design. And you can then maneuver the seat backwards and forwards in a very, very similar way, and it moves backwards and out of the way and in and forwards. Now, you may also wonder, why are the seats electrically powered? Why can't they just be powered by manual forces, like we talked about earlier, by just moving those rocker switches, moving those levers and then manually adjusting the seat? The reason it's a good idea to have electronic control of the seats is because in turbulence, by using the manual controls, what happens is you're releasing the seat from its locked position so that you can then adjust it, much like sliding your seat in the car. And as you know, in a car, they say you mustn't adjust the seat using the mechanical sliders whilst the car's moving. The reason for this is, of course, if the car suddenly brakes whilst you're maneuvering the seat, then you'll just get thrown in the direction of acceleration of the car. So let's say the car decelerates, you just get thrown forward, won't you? And it's the same with the pilot seats. If you're in turbulence and you want to adjust the seats, let's say you want to sit a little bit closer to the controls than you were, in case you want to manually fly or whatever the reason is, then you will find that, of course, in turbulence or at certain angles of the airplane while it's climbing, for example, when the nose is up high, the seat may slide suddenly in one direction and move you away from the controls. It's really not ideal to have a seat that is just freely moving around. So using the manual controls is really a backup to the electronic, which is a much better way of doing it, because like I say, those strong electric motors are actually very good at moving the seat slowly and carefully into the position you want it, both vertically and forward and backwards. So again, really important to understand that. That's why we have these electronic controls. It's not just to make it overcomplicated, it's because it is genuinely a better way of adjusting the seats in a moving aeroplane in the sky. So there is something obviously to consider here, which is that if you're sat with your seat like this and you move the seat fully forward, if you have something here, like you've crossed your legs over, or you, for whatever reason, there was something in the way, like a big tray or a big book, like the tech log on your lap, and you were to move the seat fully forward, there's potential for it to come into conflict with the yoke. It could push against the yoke. Now, the 787 in the cruise, as we are now, has the autopilot engaged, and the yoke will not move on its own. The yoke is not directly connected to the flight controls in the 787, but it does essentially function as if it were, for all intents and purposes, to the pilots. So what you could find yourself doing is, if you were to move the seat fully forward with something obstructing it or pushing against it, you'd eventually push into the yoke, and then it would not initially do anything. Pressure would build up, and then the concern would be that it could then disconnect the autopilot. The autopilot can be disconnected by overpowering the flight controls. So the yoke here is locked in place, as it were, or it's being controlled by the autopilot. It's a bit like someone else having their hands on the other yoke, even though it's just a computer. What you can then do is push against it in any direction you want, and you'll override it. This is also true on the Airbus. The same applies to the side stick. The side stick is locked in position whilst the autopilot is in, and then you can overpower it and then take control of the airplane, which is a good feature. Pilots want that. We need to be able to disconnect the autopilot. Let's say this button breaks, the autopilot disconnect button, and we want to take over anyway, then that's a way to do it, isn't it? Now, the downside of this, of course, is, like I say, is you've obstructed it, you've moved the seat forward by accident or whatever reason. It could then push against the yoke and potentially push the yoke forwards, and it would snap out of control. Or not out of control, but it would snap forwards, because it's going to, of course, respond immediately to that input. So the pressure's building up, and then it'd be quite a large change. So that would obviously, if it was moving forwards, push the airplane into a nosedive. That is a potential thing that's under discussion at the moment, but again, we don't know if that's what happens, but that is something that could happen. Like I say, there's some sort of obstruction here. And certainly, I know from sitting in the seats of the 787, if you cross your legs and then you were to try and do that, you would indeed come into conflict with the yoke. It's not a very sensible thing to do, especially if the seat's further forwards. Now, why might the seat run forward out of control? Well, that's another question, isn't it? Who knows? There's endless technical reasons. Boeing have referred operators to a service bulletin. It's back from 2017, which includes instructions for the inspection and maintaining of the switches on the flight deck seats. So that is exactly the switches we've just been talking about. So they are referring operators to that. So, you know, is there I could speculate all day about things, switches going wrong, if you spilt a drink on a switch, things like that, because of course we don't put any drinks near the panels down here, but if a drink's being passed around the side, things like that, who knows? That may or may not be the issue. There's a whole world of complexities as to what may have happened, and again, the investigation will find out. They will find out. Now, does this mean the 787 is unsafe? No, of course not. This is a common seat design, and in fact in 2014 an A330 entered a nosedive when the seat was moved forwards, and the A330 has the control isn't a yoke in the middle here, it's actually a side stick, a little joystick on the left here, and the armrest was down, so there's an armrest here, which is quite a big part of the Airbus design. And that big armrest then pushed a camera into the side stick, which pushed the nose down. So that was a very serious incident and caused a very serious nosedive. So it has happened with other aircraft manufacturers and seat designs, because it's it's something that could happen if you were to put something in between the two things. It's just the laws of physics, right? There's no way to avoid that. So we'll see if there's something going on with the seat itself, or whether there was a short circuit or problem, or whether it was just a human error, or whether it was just one of those things that could happen from sheer chance of combination of things. It nearly always is a combination of things, but there we go. Some things I want to point out though. The seats are very slow moving. You can't see it modeled in this sim, but they don't move very quickly. So as electronically, they move quite slowly, but they are relatively high torque motors, because it's quite a, it could be quite a weight, especially the motor lifting up and down, sort of lift all your body weight and the chair weight. So they're quite slow, but quite powerful electronic motors. So that is something worth noting. The other thing is, people glued to the ceiling is a scary phrase, right? It brings us to a question, well, how did that happen? How could it be such a nosedive? Well, I want to point out that this is an airplane that is not flying on rails. Sorry, it is in free air. It is in space, and as you know from turbulence, airplanes do move up and down, and you would be surprised how little movement. When you've been in what you might consider pretty bad turbulence, the airplane was probably barely moving at all, and barely deviating from its altitude. Any real deviation and you get that feeling of weightlessness. If you do a sudden dive, or sudden descent I should say, then you actually start to feel that a bit as a passenger. An aeroplane in the cruise, a commercial jetliner like this, is certified to operate from -1G to 2.5G whilst the flaps are up, like we are in the cruise here. And that way it's safe, very safe for turbulence. 2.5G is an extreme amount of turbulence, and turbulence is not unsafe. It doesn't damage airplanes. They might need an inspection if it was bad enough, but it's just not unsafe. It's just uncomfortable more than anything. Now, if you think about it, 0G would be weightless. So this airplane can go to -1G. So it can go, in the cruise now, the airplane is at 1G, plus 1G. Okay? It can then therefore go from +1 to 0 to -1G and that's still within its operating envelope. Now, it's not supposed to, but that could happen, and the airplane is still certified to do that. It's strong enough to withstand that. So my point is, if it was to go from 1 to 0, which is something you've probably never experienced on an airplane, 0G, as you've seen from those videos of the parabolic arcs and then the astronaut training, it's quite extreme. That would mean you were floating around the cabin. So if you were not strapped in, that would be very extreme, because you can imagine, think about things like the trolleys with catering and stuff floating around at 0G. That would be quite an extreme situation. -1G would mean you were actually on the ceiling with the same force that you're currently sitting in your seat at home. So that is incredibly extreme. It would be a bit like landing on your head upside down on the ground. It's incredibly unsafe, assuming you're not strapped in. Which brings me to my next point, which is wear your seatbelts. Every airline tells us this. It is standard procedure to tell passengers as well. You want to wear your seatbelt whilst you're sat down. Just because the seatbelt signs are off doesn't mean the airplane is guaranteed to spend the entire flight completely, perfectly smooth. There are lots of things that can cause turbulence in the cruise, whether it's weather, clear air turbulence, it could be a jet stream, it could be wake turbulence. So a jet stream is a very fast moving column of air. Those we get to see on charts, so we get some idea that they're coming. But things like wake turbulence, you may not be able to spot, which could just be that another airplane went through this area ahead of you. And wake turbulence is one of the more severe ones. It gives you quite a jolt. So it is recommended I would recommend you keep your seatbelt on for the whole flight, unless you need to go to the toilet or anything like that. Otherwise, when you're sat in your seat, just have your belt on, because this is the exact sort of incident where that would stop you from having an injury. Now, I'm not suggesting for a second that anybody injured was injured because they've done something wrong. Okay, you are allowed to take your seatbelts off. when the seatbelt signs are off, and if you know people need to go to the toilet, it's just a fact. You need to stretch your legs. But what I'm saying is, if for the most of the flight you have your belt on, you can reduce any chance of this happening. And again, this is so extremely rare. The reason we're all talking about it is because it's so rare. So those are some of the things I just wanted to discuss about this incident. So in summary, again, not suggesting I know what happened at all. I certainly don't, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I do. No one will until the investigation is complete. But the seats are electronically controlled, and there is potential, if you were to drive the seat, or the seat were to drive on its own, to interfere with the yoke, which could then disconnect the autopilot and cause the airplane to change level or change suddenly or abruptly in its path. The reason it can change so abruptly and suddenly is because it's certified to fly as it needs to. It's certified to fly in relatively conditions that are outside of what you might normally experience on an airliner. It is strong enough and it is maneuverable enough. It needs to be, because the pilots may need to do that. There could be a reason where you do need to fly the airplane with a fair bit of prompt force, and that is certainly something to be pleased about, that the airplanes are capable of doing this. But of course, this is a very unnerving and scary incident for those on board at the time. I don't think the 787 is unsafe. I fly on it very confidently and happily, even after this incident, because of all the reasons I've discussed above. Electronic seats are fitted to many modern airliners, and it is not a shocking idea. It's not a new idea, and it's not a Boeing specific idea to have a seat that can move. And as I said, it has happened before where electronic seats have been moved and interfered with flight controls. It's just a case of we need to be very, very careful about it. But again, don't know if that's what caused this specific incident. We shall find out in the future. Now in this sim, if I was to just push against the yoke, it actually overrides the autopilot but doesn't disconnect it like it would in the real aircraft. So what I'm going to do is just disconnect the autopilot. There we go. And then show you a bit of a maneuver. So if I nose down like this, this would be an extreme nose over. This would have you really lifting out your seat. It would be quite something, and then it would lead to an overspeed shortly after. So I just want to show you how relatively minor those changes in pitch when you're flying as fast as the 787 does can feel. So although it's called a nosedive, you might have quite an extreme idea in your head about what that means. But actually, if we were to look outside, and I'll show you again, the airplane going into 0G would be really quite subtle. It would not be an extreme nosedive as you might think. It would be. I think it would surprise people how little the airplane would need to nose over for it to trigger that feeling of weightlessness. Again, just trying to share a bit of perspective on the airplane, despite the scary headlines. Yeah, you'd be surprised how minor those nose pitch changes are to get that feeling. Remember, in turbulence, when you feel yourself being moved around the seat, the airplane is barely changing altitude or pitch attitude at all. So that's all for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope it's been interesting for you. Once again, I want to stress that this is simply a case of me giving you my own opinions. This does not represent any airline or manufacturer or any other pilot's thoughts on this. This is simply my own thoughts on how those seats are operated across the industry and what they're like on the Boeing 787, just to give you a bit of an idea of how that aspect of the airplane works. I also want to stress to you how safe aviation is, how this is such a rare event, and it was still an airplane that was it was ultimately brought back under control and landed safely because these airplanes are capable of flying in relatively extreme situations, certainly more extreme than you would expect to see on a normal flight. I'm not for a second trying to diminish the experience that those people went through, which is absolutely awful. Of course, it's not something people expect to do. And like I say, I'm not suggesting anyone's done anything wrong at any point in this video. I don't want to suggest that at all. But I must say, this is just another reminder from me that whilst you're sat in your seat, keep your seatbelt on. You are still sat on an aeroplane. Turbulence is not unsafe for the aeroplane. But the best way to keep yourself safe is to have your belt on whenever you're sat in your seat, just to maximise the time that you're strapped in. But like I say, it's obviously understandable that you can't do that for the entire flight necessarily. Also, it's very good to walk around and get the blood flowing through your legs on long haul flights, so of course that's a whole other topic. But this is a very rare event, and something that hopefully we will see after the investigation and recommendations are put out, no sort of repeat of, not only on the 787 but on other aircraft as well, depending on how the investigation goes. That's all then. This is a very rare video for me. I don't talk about incidents normally, and I certainly don't talk about ones that are under investigation, but I just felt that with all the discussion about seat design, I wanted to just share some of my thoughts on it. There'll be plenty more tutorials. I've got another tutorial coming on the 787 very soon, so do please subscribe if you'd like to see more about how we operate the Boeing 787 Dreamliner in the real world. But otherwise, please keep safe and well. We'll see you in another video or live stream soon. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.